replicated ledgers all interchangeably. That's kind of accidental, but also kind of deliberate in a sense that it's a reflection on where we are at the moment. In that there's lots of different ideas. But anyway, framing what we're talking about. Over the last 50 years, computers obviously have been getting cheaper and cheaper and more powerful. And we're at the point now where computers, it's now realistic to think about storing data across multiple devices, replicating it massively. So a little thought experiment I thought would be worth doing this afternoon. So let me ask you, if we were to create a register of the entire US population, how much data do you think we'd need? How much storage space would we need for that? Any ideas? No ideas. So let me just help you here. So more or less, there's about 300 million citizens in the US. So that's, what's that, 3 times 10 to the 8. And how much data would we need for a basic register? So name, address, that kind of thing. So say 100 bytes. So that means we need to store 3 times 10 to the 10 bytes of data, right? So that's 3 times 10 to the 7K, 3 times 10 to the 4 meg, 3 times 10 to the 1 gig, 30 gig. I can store all of that on my mobile phone, right? So we're in a situation where genuinely, now I'm not suggesting that we would want to do that, but genuinely we're in a situation where we have enormous power at our fingertips. And this, I think this really does change things. It changes the way that we can think about architecting systems. And the idea that you have data replicated massively across lots of devices is something we couldn't do before. But blockchain, shared ledgers, call them what you will, is more than just about data storage. It's about execution as well, processing, about the way that what we do with the data. And this is a diagram. We have a few flavors of this diagram. But the idea is that we're not just talking about storing data in lots of places and replicating it massively, but we're talking about all of those computers doing the same processing, executing the same programs, all of them doing all of the processing. It's kind of counterintuitive because up till now we've had, you have a distributed database and one system would do the calculation, do the processing. But the idea is that all those computers can do all the processing all at the same time, and that gives you really interesting properties in terms of, particularly if that processing is cryptographically verifiable, a very high degree of resilience, and obviously if those computers are all executing the same program deterministically, which is what we're trying to achieve here, you end up with a point where you have a great deal of confidence about what was done with the data. It's a bit like, the analogy would be a bit like, those old typing pools where you were doing data entry and the typist you'd have 5 typists all entering the data at the same time. The reason you would do that is because some of them would make an error, but if they're all entering the data together, you'll spot the errors because most of them get it right most of the time. At least that was the idea. So that's kind of what we're talking about. And the question is, what's this got to do with identity? So as Steve mentioned in the session this morning, there's lots of ridiculous ideas being proposed for how we might use shared ledgers or shared ledger technology. And the question we need to ask ourselves is identity one of those use cases that makes sense? So we have at Consult Hyperion some exam questions that we ask of potential use cases for blockchain. And there's 5 key questions that we ask about blockchain. And really these key questions, these key characteristics are things about blockchain technology. And let me just run through them. So the first one is, we're talking about a ledger where there are many writers. By that I don't just mean lots of computers write into one database. We have that already with distributed databases. Really what I mean is potentially competing organizations that wouldn't necessarily work together previously, wanting to collaborate and share data for some reason. So that is the application doing that in any way? That's the first question. Second question is about immutability. The idea with this technology is that you create an unchangeable, immutable record of all history of the set of transactions that you're dealing with? Is that something that's important to you? Is it necessary to get some degree of transparency? The idea of this ledger is that everyone can read it. And so, is that something that's important? Limited trust. So across these many writers, as I already kind of indicated, they may not trust each other completely. Is that something that's important? And last but not least, is the application transactional in nature? Because what we're typically talking about is assets being passed from party to party. That's at least what happens in Bitcoin. In Bitcoin, you have an asset, it's Bitcoin currency, and you pass it transactionally from one identity to another identity to another identity. So the question is, does this, how does identity stack up against these criteria? So I'll just flick up the answers here. I'm not going to talk through these in detail, but I'll pick out a couple. So the first one I wanted to talk about was the two at the top here about many writers. And we live in a situation at the moment where we have identity providers kind of exist in silos. So in the UK, we have this program called Verify, which is, I'm pretty supportive of the program. It's an initiative to try and initially enable private sector to provide digital identity to government. Each one of those identity providers maintains its own database. It's an identity provider, and it doesn't share that data. And in a sense, you could think that probably one identity provider is kind of competitive with another identity provider. They're both trying to build databases of identities. They're both trying to build relationships with customers. So the question is, would they want to share data in some way? Would they want to collaborate and have a single ledger for all that data? And for me, that's not completely clear. I had this idea here about relying parties working without identity providers. What I mean by that is, for me, an identity provider, an attribute provider, and a relying party, those are all actually the same organization potentially. I use the services of a bank. So in that sense, the bank is a relying party. But in the course of transacting with that bank, the bank gets to know me, so they can then assert something about me. They maybe know that I'm a reliable customer, so they can then become an attribute provider. Equally, they might establish some credentials with me or something, so they can be an IDP as well. So for me, the role that an organization takes kind of changes depending on the context within the transaction. And so the idea there that organizations could maybe collaborate together to share data, that seems interesting. I'm not quite sure how it would work commercially, but there's something there potentially. I think immutability, that's clear. I mean, obviously, if you're going to make an identity assertion, there's going to be some issue about non-repudiation, wanting to be able to go back and show that transaction was valid at the point in time that it was done. Transparency is an interesting one. Obviously, it's kind of linked to non-repudiation, perhaps more to do with auditability. You want to show that the transaction was performed and be able to check that it was done correctly. But there's a question about privacy as well. So how do you balance the privacy needs of identity systems with the need to be auditable as well? Trust, we often talk about trust in the context of identity. Here, with blockchain, or with shared ledgers, we're talking about environments where the organizations don't trust each other. So there's kind of something there potentially. I'm not going to go into that in a lot of detail. And the one for me that's the most important one for us to get our heads around is transactional. Identity is fundamentally not transactional. I have an identity, it's Steve. I have an identity, I'm called Steve. I'm not going to give my name to Rob down here. He's Rob, right? I'm always going to be Steve. I'm not going to transfer that to someone. So there's a question about that. We'll come back to that in a bit. I thought it'd be worth us, as well as just thinking about blockchain or shared ledgers and what the characteristics are, and do they kind of fit with identity, to actually step back and go, well, actually, is there a problem with identity? Is there a problem we're actually trying to fix here? Is this a solution looking for a problem, or is there actually a problem? And if there is a problem, why haven't we already solved it? So clearly, there is a problem with identity today. These are the ways that these are the kind of some of the issues I would suggest are the key problems with identity. So identity today is very fragmented. So I have an identity with my bank. I have an identity with my mobile operator. I have an identity with a few different social media players. I have an identity with every merchant that forces me to create an account with them. Normally that's enough for me to not buy from that merchant, but anyway. So at the moment, identity is fragmented. We have lots of identities. Each one of those organizations creates a record, an account for me, maybe makes me create some user ID and password that I don't want to create. So for me as an individual, that's a massive inconvenience, and it's quite dangerous because you have all the issues with password management and people copying passwords and that kind of stuff. Creates another problem, which is that there's issues of data breach. So today, all those organizations, quite often, they'll have big databases full of data, and there are all sorts of organizations get breached. So we had a mobile operator had a big breach. No one really knows how big it was. It got a lot of press coverage anyway. Had a breach last year. There have been breaches of government data, biometrics databases in the Philippines, all sorts of places. Organizations that you would think need to protect your data, they make mistakes. They don't do things properly. They cut corners. So breaches occur. And breaches occur because of the way that data is stored at the moment. I've talked about portability, and that's kind of closely linked to this idea of self-sovereignty at the moment. At the moment, other people create identities for me. So I have an identity with the bank, but really they view it as their version of me. It's not my identity. I don't control it. I don't have a lot of say in it. So the idea that I could have an identity, manage it myself, be responsible for it, and make some decisions about where my data gets shared and who it gets shared with, and be able to go along later on and say, actually, I said I wanted you to have access to my identity, but I'm going to turn it off now. We can't do that today. I thought it also is worth just asking, why have digital identity initiatives failed up to this point in time? There's been lots of initiatives over the last 15, 20 years, things that have been promised, and they haven't quite delivered on their promise. And I think there are a number of reasons that you could call out, but these are the ones that I wanted to just touch on today. So the first one is about adoption. Identity is a kind of a two-sided thing. You have to have people with identities. There has to be a critical mass of identities, and there've got to be places where you can use that identity as well. If you don't have either of those, then it's kind of a problem, because you go to a merchant or to a relying party, say, hey, why don't you integrate with this identity service? And they'll say, well, great, fine. How many customers will that bring us? Well, none. Well, that's not very interesting, And the other thing as well, it works the other way around as well. It's like, well, hey, consumer, here's a great identity thing that you can have to manage your identity. Well, where can I use it? Well, nowhere. That's kind of a problem. Adoption and critical mass is a big problem. And so that's the first thing. Second thing, the second two really are kind of related. Value. So individuals have been taught not to value their identity. Lots of internet services are offered for free. They're free because they're paid for through targeted advertising. What that does is it reduces the value that people place in their identity, in their data, in the way that they use those services. So that, for me, is a big problem. And I think, we're some way from individual citizens being prepared to, for example, pay for their identity. And I think that's potentially quite an issue, because you need to, if you're going to be responsible for protecting your identity, you'll only do that if you value it. Now, these things are kind of changing. I think people are becoming more aware of privacy, but for me, that's a big problem. And then at the other end, there's also a value thing as well. So businesses have, typically have seen personal data as being a competitive advantage. They need to collect data. They need to have the data so that no one else, so that their competitors don't. And the idea that you can collect data, monetize, and then you profile customers so that you can spam them or send them advertising, whatever. For me, that's a problem because it's not creating a relationship of trust between you and your customer. And I think at the moment, we're in the situation where a lot of businesses don't really appreciate that perhaps if they engage with their customers in a different way, that could lead to a more positive outcome. So the question is, that all being said, does blockchain help us with any of this? So I think it could help us with some of these things on the left. Blockchain provides an architecture, or shared ledgers can potentially provide an architecture to deal with some of these areas of fragmentation. Lots of the stuff that's being done in terms of some of the sort of crypto thinking around blockchain could address some of these issues around self-sovereignty, around privacy, those kind of things. But most importantly, I don't think it solves any of those problems on the right-hand side. These problems on the right-hand side are not technological problems. They're business problems. And for me, that's one of the biggest questions. So I also, so we talked a couple of slides ago about what's the characteristics of blockchain or of shared ledgers, and how does that relate to identity? I want to just ask the question the other way around quickly. What are the characteristics of identity? It's the same question coming at it from a slightly different angle. And some of this stuff is stuff I've already touched on, but I think it's helpful to kind of think about things from multiple facets, from multiple angles. So the first thing I wanted to just say is this. In the real world, we don't store identities in ledgers. In the real world, we store identities in registers or possibly directories, similar kind of term. So I've already mentioned this. Identity is not about the transfer of assets and who owns those assets. Identity is about being able to create something for me that I can then protect. Do you like what I did there with the little sliding X? You have to watch carefully next time. So that one doesn't really score very well. The next one. So one of the big things about Bitcoin was a sort of a way of solving the double spending problem. How can I, in a digital world where data can just be replicated all over the place, how can I prevent an asset or a Bitcoin or whatever from being spent twice? Now, in fact, with identity, it's the other way around. I want to be able to double spend my identity. I want to be able to say, hey, I'm over 18 to this organization, and then say the same thing to this organization over there, right? But I want to be able to prevent anyone else that I've shared my identity with from then saying, hey, we know that Stephen, he's over 18. We can then sell that data on to someone else, right? So there is something related to double spending, but it's not double spending. I want to be able to spend my identity, but I want only me to be able to spend my identity. So that doesn't quite fit either. There's a question about frequency. So, and I'm just picking out two things here. Authentication. So we have identification, which is probably what you do at the beginning to set up your identity. Authentication is what you do transactionally at the time you're doing something, logging on, buying something, whatever. Authentication is high frequency and needs to be real time. When I'm logging on to my bank or when I'm shopping, it's got to happen immediately. And authentication, you'll be authenticating all over the place, all sorts of different services. So that doesn't seem to fit, particularly when you think that blockchain technology, it's quite inefficient, deliberately inefficient. However, identification, I think, is slightly different. Identification is a low-frequency event. It's something you do not very often. Increasingly, it needs to be real time. So a lot of our customers are banks. And what those banks are really interested in at the moment is how they can engage with customers digitally. So, for example, can I enroll a customer into mobile banking and go through the whole enrollment process, including all the KYC, so that I can get the customer on board there and then, whilst I've got them captured in the mobile app. If I have to then, at some point break the process and they've got to go and visit a branch or receive a letter in the post, I potentially lose them at that point. So that's not great. So the idea that I can do these low frequency events, but when I do them, make it work in the channel that I'm in, that could be quite important. And obviously, if there was a means through which I could establish identity in a sort of robust way, digitally, that would work. So I've given this one a tick, but it's a bit of a tenuous tick. One of the things that, I mentioned the word deterministic earlier. So determinism is about doing a set of things and knowing the outcome, having a kind of predictable outcome. And so with this kind of technology, a lot of it is about predictability, being able to do the same thing and guaranteeing that it's going to have a particular outcome. Identity is not like that. There's no such thing as a deterministic identity. So when I do a KYC for a bank, the bank is doing things like they're checking my passport, they're going and touching a credit bureau. They go through a set of steps to comply with regulation, but those things are not absolute. My passport, the passport I present them, could be fake, right? I might have managed to create a false identity with the passport agency as well. So there's always a level of risk around identity. So that doesn't quite seem to square with what we're talking about here. But for me, coming back to that point about transactions, I said that identity is not transactional. However, it turns out in a kind of way it is. When a bank does a KYC on me, it does a KYC on me at the beginning when I open an account, but actually what it needs to do is it needs to keep checking my identity, because my identity will change. I might move, so my address might change. Something might happen about my status. Eventually, I'll pass away, right? So there's a need to constantly keep rechecking and touching the identity. So the idea that you can have a record of here are all the touch points for the identity, and you can then go back and say, well, actually, we can see there's a provenance around this identity. We can look back in time and see that identity isn't just something that we can verify now, but we can see that actually it's been, in good stead for the whole period of time. That for me is quite powerful. And so I think if we're going to do anything with blockchain or shared ledger related around identity, it's going to be something to do with that. So just to wrap up, what do I think about all this? For me, the biggest issues with digital identity are not technological. And so whilst we might try and solve some of them with blockchain or shared ledger technology, really we need to focus on the non-technological problems, the business problems, and the things around value of identity. Because if we don't solve those, then what we're doing is probably going to fail. As it stands, out of the box, right? Blockchain shared ledger technology doesn't quite fit with identity. There's a lot of similarities. There's a lot of things that resonate, but it doesn't quite fit. However, I think there are lots of things that we can learn from it, and I think there are lots of things that we can maybe take some of the ideas that exist in the blockchain, in the shared ledger thinking, and create some architectures for identity that will be far better than what we have today. So the idea that I have a strong cryptographic identity based on a private public key pair that's under my control, that's anonymous to start with, I can then attach information around that in a way that's controlled by me. For me, that's quite interesting and quite powerful. So I'm kind of sitting on the fence a little bit, I suppose. But really what I wanted to say was, I think there's something in this, but I'm not quite sure we properly understand what that is yet. And on that note, I'll finish. 4 seconds left.
Thanks, Steve. We're right up on time. Perhaps one question, if there's one out there. No, good. Now, this morning, a question about... Yep. Yeah. Would you like to ask? No?
Yeah, yell it out.
I think the points you made are really important and good for
I know, it's a very good question. It's a really good question, and I think this is, I guess the point I'm making here is that on the one hand, right, there will be some kinds of advertising that I want to receive, or that I'm happy to receive, but on the other hand, there are things that are invasive, things that are inconvenient, and so I think we have to, as an industry, be exploring those architectures, those models that create the possibility that I can have some control over what I have. I'm not really answering your question very effectively because I don't really know the answer, right? And I agree with you that there are those big players who currently dominate the identity space in effect. But I think what we can do is, this is potentially a catalyst for change. It helps us to think about things differently. And I think we have to challenge the status quo. But I'm not exactly sure how that's going to play out.
Thank you, Steve. So just want to go back to this morning and the last session we had before lunch, which was Steve Wilson. Steve left us speechless. I think with those of you who are here would have know what I mean. But actually, Steve wants some help from you. So I'm just going to pass the mic across to Steve just to let him ask.
Thanks, Rob. And I promise that I'm not filibustering. But in the excitement or the lack of excitement this morning, I forgot to mention that my firm, Constellation Research, is doing ongoing research on the R&D projects that are developing, let's say, second and third generation distributed consensus. So I mentioned a couple already. I think that R3 is setting out an R&D agenda. Swirls, that we're going to hear from now, Swirls and Ping are doing a really good job of setting out an R&D agenda. So I don't know whether it's going to work yet or not, but I really like the methodology. And I'm casting around for more case studies of distributed ledger methodologies and processes that people would like to share publicly or otherwise, but we will have another research report out in the next 4 to 6 weeks. And so it's a call for contributions and conversation about where the R&D is heading and success stories that we can talk about and share. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. Well, we're back together in 7 minutes, so I'll see you then.